Rich, why don't we start with how did you meet Brandon? How did you get involved in this case?
Well, Brandon reached out to me back in October of 2019. He contacted us, said he needed some help, wanted to meet with me on a weekend, and so went down to my office on a Sunday, and he came in and just started telling this incredible story of cults and murder and just bizarre stuff. And I was having a hard time actually keeping up with what he was trying to tell me. He was clearly anxious and fearful. He had just been shot at, and he was convinced that somebody might try again, and he was in danger. His kids were in danger, and he didn't know what was going on and where it was going to come from. So he was looking for help.
So this was just a matter of days after that attempted shooting on his life.
Yeah, I think it well, like maybe a week or so later, he didn't feel like the Gilbert police were doing enough and quickly enough, and
And
so
at
he
the,
was out.
at the time, did you all know, did he know that JJ and Tylie were missing?
No, we knew that. I mean, my focus at that point was finding Brandon's wife, Melanie, finding Alex Cox, and finding the Jeep, because those were everything involved in the shooting against Brandon.
Right.
Uh, so I did. I found Alex and Melanie together, loading up furniture at a house that Melanie had been renting, and they loaded it up in this U-Haul. Um, I never saw the Jeep because, as it turns out, it was already in Rexburg. Um, and so, I knew about the kids in those first conversations, and I knew about Kay Woodcock, and I knew that she was had not had contact with the kids, and it was just sort of added to the story. At that point, Charles Vallow had been dead for a couple of months, and he was convinced that that was a murder, even though the local police were viewing it more as a self-defense. So he wasn't getting any satisfaction. He really didn't know what was going on. Um,
Now, as a
so,
private
yeah,
investigator, at that point, what do you do? Because it seems like it's a complicated story. Your
right.
client almost lost his life. At that point, no one knows if the kids are dead or alive or whatever, and you're focused on Brandon's case. How did you begin that initial investigation?
Well, the first off was just to try to find Melanie, and I knew that she had this rental house, so I went to that neighborhood and just started talking to neighbors and leaving my card. And I checked out the house. It looked like somebody had just left. There was still towels hanging on the fence out by the swimming pool. There was some kids' bikes there, and it looked like somebody had just gone grocery shopping. There was no car in the garage. The garage door had windows, and I could see in there. There was no car, and the neighbors were telling me that they hadn't seen her in a couple of weeks. And so I just left my card. Said, if you see anything, let me know. Then I went and started, I made contact with Melanie Gibb because I was aware from what Brandon said that Melanie Gibb was part of that small group of people with Lori and Melanie Boudreaux. And so I went and knocked on Melanie Gibb's door, tracked her down, and told her I was looking for Melanie Boudreaux. And she said she didn't know anything about it, told me to leave, basically. Wouldn't talk to me anymore. I slipped my card under the security door, and and I left. I assumed just based on her reaction that she was on the phone with Melanie before I ever even hit the end of the sidewalk.
Mm.
It was just that kind of reaction. So I figured at that point the word was out that I was looking for people. And then I found, I was out on Halloween trick or treating with my grandkids, and I started getting phone calls from the neighbors uh, saying there's a U-Haul backed up to Melanie's house. So that's when I went headed down there, and that's when I saw Alex and Melanie together loading furniture, and that lasted into the next day. They came back and loaded more. They left a bunch of stuff out on the curb, bunch of kids' toys and clothes with a little cardboard sign on it that said free. And it was kind of creepy. I followed them to a restaurant and watched them, kind of sat at a table next to them and watched them interacting. They seemed pretty stressed. I followed them to um, Zulima's house. That's where they were staying. They parked the U-Haul outside of her house. They stayed there overnight. And they took a weird kind of trip up east of Phoenix the next day, came back and stashed the U-Haul in a parking lot outside of a sporting goods store for a day. And I was actually sitting in the parking lot watching that U-Haul when they showed up. Alex and her showed up in her car, and they got out. Alex got into the U-Haul carrying a duffel bag, a military style duffel bag, and she got back in her car and they drove off and headed straight to Rexburg. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
So
they were.
is that kind of the first sign or signal you had that they're moving to Idaho?
Yeah, we knew that Lori had already moved up there, and presumably with the kids, and that's what Kay was saying. Um, and of course, the trick there is the reason I knew that they were headed to Rexburg was while they were loading the furniture into that U-Haul, I slipped a GPS unit onto that U-Haul,
Mm.
and so I was watching everywhere they went. And but the scary part was that Brandon had left Arizona with the kids and gone to his parents' house outside of Salt Lake City. So we knew that Alex and Melanie were running around knocking on doors all over the Phoenix area at former friend's house looking for the kids. She even posted on social media offering a reward for information about where the presence of her kids. But Brandon was hiding them. Now they're in a U-Haul headed straight in that direction. Watched them head out of Arizona, straight north to Flagstaff, across the border. We had no idea if they'd gotten information and maybe headed toward Brandon and the kids. So it was like air traffic control from here. I was on the phone with the American Fork Police. We had vehicle identification. I had pictures of everybody. I knew what the license plate was. I knew about Alex's criminal history. I provided all this information to the American Fork Police, and they were ready. They were positioned all over the place. And then we, on GPS, watched them drive right straight past. They were within a few miles of the house where Brandon and those kids were. And they
And
kept
kept going.
they never stopped. They stopped once at a yogurt shop south of Salt Lake, but otherwise kept right on moving and right through Salt Lake. I had an investigator physically following them through Salt Lake City, all the way to the Idaho border,
Wow.
and then they just kept going. Now, once they got to Rexburg, they went right straight to the apartment or that townhouse complex where we knew that at that point we knew that Lori was there. So it was clear they were all getting together there. That's when Kay asked about the kids. At that point, up to now, I'd been looking for adults, but Brandon had talked to Kay about what we were doing, and so then we turned our attention to trying to find the kids. And I had contacted a retired FBI agent I knew up in Pocatello who um, started poking around up there and scoping things out and trying to find the kids. He went to JJ's school, talked to a school principal, I believe, and we found out that the kids had just not been seen.
Yeah.
And so it was just after a discussion, they decided to contact Rexburg police and ask for that welfare check. And that's when everything changed.
Right, right. Yeah, JJ had gone for a few days, I believe, and then Lori pulled him out saying she was going to homeschool him.
Right.
Did Brandon believe from the beginning that it was Alex who tried to shoot him out of that Jeep?
Yes, Brandon believed it was Alex.
And
And
did you believe, or did you know how intricately involved Lori was in all of it?
no, I mean it frankly, the person in any of these kinds of cases, you always ask who benefits. And in this case, it was clearly his wife, Melanie. She wanted the kids, and he had $1 million life insurance policy. And he knew that Charles Vallow had $1 million life insurance policy, and that Alex Cox had just killed him. Uh, During all this, also, shots were fired at Tammy Daybell,
Right.
and then she died in her sleep while all this is going on. So now we got people just dropping dead, and the kids are missing, and there's insurance stuff going all around. But really, our focus was on Melanie at that point, her and thinking that she would be the one that would benefit. She was under the influence of Lori. There was no doubt about that. And you knew that they were all together up there. So it just sort of looked like one large conspiracy. And as to why, Alex didn't have any beef with Brandon directly, but he was the guy who pulled the trigger on Charles. He recognized the Jeep because he knew that was Charles' Jeep that Charles had given to Tylie, and had Texas plates on it still. That Jeep showed up on some license plate reader cameras around town prior to that shooting. And then it was just kind of this circumstantial situation that really kind of pointed to it being Alex driving that Jeep.
Do you remember at what point when you realized, wow, Lori is involved in all of this, or at least, leading it, or whatever her involvement is? Or is that kind of a gradual thing as you're learning step by step?
Well, I mean, we knew that she was involved in Charles' death.
Mhm.
That was pretty clear, and it was a heck of a coincidence that Tammy Daybell died at that time. And so it just looked like this group, that they had plans. These dark spirits were being eliminated, and so that's who was doing what, who was pulling the strings. That was not clear. Was it really Chad? Was he the cult leader, if you will, or was it Lori? Was it them together? How many people were involved in this thing? We really didn't know. Uh, it's it was There was a lot more questions than there were answers in those early days of it. But uh, Charles had left a lot of information before he died. He was so worried, so uh, convinced that he was going to be killed that he changed the life insurance policy so that Lori couldn't get it, and then he gave all of his account information and passwords and everything to Kay Woodcock. Well, she shared those with me, and I started monitoring the Amazon account. And that's when we saw him buy these wedding rings, the infamous green jade,
The Malachite.
the malachite, before Tammy Daybell was dead. They were buying these rings, and in fact, they bought a man's ring and a woman's ring, and she returned the man's ring because it was the wrong size,
Mhm.
and had to get another one. But she was using Charles Vallow's Amazon account to buy all this stuff, and she was listing the address in Hawaii for the stuff to be sent to. So we were sort of from a distance. I mean, we were monitoring all of this movement, and of course passing information on to law enforcement as it developed. And then of course the Jeep, Rexburg police found this Jeep at that complex and took it into custody. It was being sought by Gilbert police, so there was a law enforcement cooperation there. And we found it very interesting that none of that group reported that Jeep being stolen. It was in custody of Rexburg police, but they didn't call anybody to say, "Hey, our Jeep's missing out of the garage up here."
That's a good point. Yeah. You'd think you'd call the police if you woke up one morning and your car is not in your driveway.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And it wasn't. So that was kind of an interesting. We were kind of laughing about that a little bit, but
So when all this is happening and no one's quite sure of who's where, or no one's been arrested and people are worried for their safety, what do you tell Brandon? I mean, what do you advise your client to do? Because he's got to live day to day.
yeah, well, he was definitely in hiding. Basically, it was lay low. Our best bet was to keep an eye on where everybody was. It's and and of course we knew that Lori and Chad had taken off to Hawaii. We knew about the wedding in Vegas, where everybody got married all at once, and so we were just kind of keeping an eye on them. But she did find out. She showed up at that house where Brandon and the kids were staying. This was at Brandon's parents' house. She showed up there, almost got herself killed. She was in the garage, and Brandon's dad walked out in the garage to find this person standing there. He heard noises.
You're talking about Melanie.
I'm sorry, Melanie. Did I say
Yeah.
Lori?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Melanie was in the garage. So she found out. And Alex was parked in the just down the street. Melanie got charged with trespassing on that incident.
She came to get
So
her kids.
yeah, she came to get the kids. She'd been after the kids the whole time. And then of course all of this stuff gets laid out in the divorce proceedings that Brandon filed, and that became a big deal because he was laying out this potential conspiracy that he believed still at that point that Melanie was a co-conspirator at the very group was he was in danger and his kids were in danger, and that was the argument he was making in his divorce action in court here in Phoenix to get sole custody of the kids. All of this religion stuff became a part of that case, and it was touted. It became a very aggressive case. Melanie had attorneys that held a press conference and blasted Brandon, really, and got themselves in trouble with the state bar over how they handled that case. And so it was, it did play out a bit, even, everybody's focused on these trials, these criminal trials against Lori, but a lot of this played out in those divorce pleadings
Why do
in
you think
Brandon's
Melanie
case.
hasn't been charged?
Well, clearly there isn't evidence. The whole case is a conspiracy case, and it's circumstantial. So, Brandon believes that that was the Jeep, and Brandon believes that Alex was in it. But they're really, unlike the shooting of Charles Vallow, where there's no question about who was firing the gun. Really is, from a legal perspective, there is a question here. So it's just how sure is his testimony? How certain is he of that? So the circumstantial case to prove the conspiracy has got to be in some kind of communications that were going on between all these actors. It had to be if Alex was in that Jeep, there had to be. That doesn't mean Lori. I mean, they could use location data from cell phone towers, for instance, but that wouldn't put Lori there. That would potentially put Alex there, but not Lori. And yet, so there had to be some kind of text messaging or something going on there. And I'm not privy to what the disclosures have been, even in this case. But there had to be some kind of communications between them that are specific enough that could be a reasonable inference could be drawn about what they were planning to do or had done. But obviously, Melanie is not a part of that. Whatever there must not have been sufficient evidence to suggest that she and Alex and Lori all conspired together.
And so
Now,
with Chad, you could say probably that Chad, that's why they're
yeah,
not charging him.
and we saw that in the Charles Vallow murder case that there was text messaging that went on that linked all of these together. And I suspect more of that is going to come out in this particular trial, but it probably will not include Melanie. If if she wasn't representing herself, if she had a defense team, um, this would be an easier case to defend than any of the others because it is a kind of a circumstantial and conspiracy case. Her defense team could be pointing at Melanie and could be pointing at Alex. And, unless there's something really tangible, some communication with Lori and Alex that put her in the driver's seat of getting rid of Brandon for whatever reason. Who knows? I mean, pure speculation on my part, but she was unable to collect the life insurance policy on Charles, but they knew that Brandon had a similar amount of money. I think that if they needed the money, and they were already saying that Brandon was a dark spirit, that does sort of give Lori a financial motive
Right.
to go after Brandon, to help the cause, to
Right.
finance the cause, if you
Well,
will.
in all of these trials, you'd think they really could have gone after Alex a lot more. He's not here to defend himself. He really
Oh,
did do the dirty work,
right.
quote unquote.
Yeah, and if anybody was, he should have been the boogeyman in this case.
Yeah.
He was the easy guy to blame. But the problem with Alex is he didn't have a motive directly. But the biggest problem is Lori herself lying to the police about where the kids were while they were missing. She wasn't out looking for them, and she deliberately giving diversionary information to law enforcement at the time that they're missing. Uh, that puts her smack in the middle of the conspiracy.
Rich, did you think the children were alive? Whoa. Right.
Well, the longer that they were missing, the less likely it was. And given what was going on up there, um, it it's, you get a little cynical after doing this for a long time, and it all indications were that it was pointing that direction. And but you're always holding out hope. I think law enforcement knew fairly early on where the kids likely were. Um, they were saying things like they had to wait till the snow melted.
Right.
So, I think there was some understanding or some belief that that's where they were going to find them.
Were you surprised just how horrific the murders were, the conditions of the children's bodies?
Oh yeah, that what happened to those kids was horrifying. It was horrifying that they were murdered, but then to the brutality of the post-mortem kind of brutality was just horrifying. It's hard to fathom how anybody could do that to another person, let alone children they are related to. It is mind-boggling to I don't know how you'd ever reconcile that stuff. It's even killing of Tammy Daybell was certainly bad. It was a suffocation, strangulation, whatever uh, there, and then the shooting of Charles. Those are all pretty quick and rapid, and but then this, you're dismembering and you're burning and wrapping them in plastic and burying them. It's just, oh man,
Yeah.
that's the part that is. I'm sure that Brandon and Kay and others wake up in the middle of the night with these images. Is just too horrifying and too painful to think about.
Yeah, when you've seen him, you don't forget him. Brandon
Right.
Brandon really is lucky to be alive.
He's the only survivor in this thing,
Right.
if you think about it. He came very close. I mean, that bullet struck the window just above his head, and
I mean,
uh,
had his window been down or
right,
anything, I mean, had he been an inch, I mean, you always go through these what if
yeah, the
scenarios.
what ifs, yeah. But I mean, he was in the same situation as Tammy. She escaped death apparently a
Right.
few weeks before, and but it came back after her in
Right.
a different way. So could that have, I think that's one of the things that was really in Brandon's mind too, that this wasn't necessarily a one-off.
Yeah.
Uh, so it was definitely a scary time. And then to see them traveling toward where he was that day, when following that U-Haul all the way up, watching him going right toward that house where he was staying with the kids. That's there was some pucker time there. I was sitting in Phoenix watching the movements and coordinating with police and everything else, and we were holding our breath as to whether there was a confrontation coming.
Is it hard to believe that it's been almost 6 years since you started this?
That is the crazy part. Yeah, it is hard to believe. And once law enforcement was involved, I kind of, I stepped away from doing some active investigation on it because I didn't want to stomp all over law enforcement investigation. There was no purpose of that. You had multiple agencies involved at that point. And but we cooperated with them, and to the extent our information was helpful, I mean, it great. But then watching the whole criminal process uh, was kind of interesting just to watch from, because normally I do criminal defense work mostly. So I'm usually sitting at the defense table with people like Lori and
Mm,
Chad. And I kept watching all of this thinking, how would I defend this case? What would I be doing on their defense teams? And it, I was not impressed. I was just not impressed with what happened in Idaho, or certainly down here with her representing herself. But even in the Idaho cases, it seemed like there was a lot more they could have and should have done. But in challenging the forensics, uh, they did very little of that. But it was the right result. I mean, based on all the evidence, it's regardless of whether she had a better defense team and whether she had a good defense team down here instead of herself. I think she was going to get convicted regardless.
yeah. Do you think that we'll actually have a trial that begins this week?
you know, I don't know how sick she is. At a certain point, because of the problem with the jury pool, they've already sort of pared down the jury pool based on this group's availability to sit through certain dates. If this thing pushes into that July 4th time frame, then you're going to lose a whole bunch of prospective jurors. So there's a good chance that if she's sick more than a week or so, they may have to push this off into the fall.
Yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me.
I mean,
This
that's the
stuff
thought.
happens. This stuff happens. Yeah.
It does happen, and the jurors could come again on Wednesday, but like the judge said today, how much longer can you ask them to keep coming back? And then
Right.
you've got to schedule courtrooms. There's a whole lot more than just okay,
Yeah, and,
push it
and
off.
there's other scheduling conflicts. I mean, the judge himself is scheduling his other trials around this one. The prosecutor's got other cases. I mean, there's so many moving parts to trials, and picking out trial dates that once you have a slot that you can drop one in, you do everything you can to preserve that slot, because it's going to screw up all kinds of things if you don't.
Well, as you said earlier, if it's going to happen where someone gets sick, I guess now is the ideal time rather than once it's started.
Yeah, because once you've started and paneled a jury, then prejudice attaches, and you have to declare a mistrial, and then lots of things change. At least at this point, it's just a matter of moving the schedule and bringing in a new pool, and the jury commissioner can certainly do that.
Right. Rich, can you give everybody a little bit of your background just so they understand how you got involved in becoming a private investigator?
Oh, okay. Well, I was a journalist for almost 30 years. I was an investigative reporter at the Arizona Republic. I was the head of the investigative team for about a decade. Went off and did television for about 5 years, and then after all those years, decided that kind of wanted to strike out on my own. So a guy told me about private investigations work, and I looked at that and thought, well, it's the same skill set, and so I did that. And this is my 25th year as a private investigator. So I did almost as much time as a PI as I had as a journalist.
No
And
wonder you're such a good interview. Now, tell me, is there anything in this trial that you're most looking forward to learning or hearing?
Um, I guess it's that digital evidence that I'm not privy to what it is that puts Lori uh, in the conspiracy. Uh, I think it's going to be all that digital, the phone communications, maybe some cell tower location data. Um, that's probably more what's going to resonate with this. There's no real ballistics to do. There's no trajectory because there's so many unknowns and frankly that stuff doesn't even put Alex at the scene. So I don't think they recovered any bullets that were forensically able to do any kind of analysis and link it to a suspect weapon, for example. Um, I don't know enough about and you may know this, as to what, if any, GSR was done on the Jeep, any gunshot residue, whether or not that's was done and whether it was consistent. That's another area that could be challenged from a defense perspective.
Good.
Uh, but it really, I'm very curious about the communications between Lori and Alex. I think that's going to be what's makes or breaks this case.
Yeah. Awesome. Anything that you want to add, Rich?
No, we were. It's what happens next is going to be interesting when the appeals start. It's going to go into a lull from a public perspective, but there's going to be a lot of work done by appellate attorneys. I, I'm, but that's mostly going to come out of Idaho more than Arizona, I think. And it's going to be a many years long process. And we can't forget that Chad, it's not just about Lori, it's about Chad's case too. And some appellate lawyers are going to be coordinating on that and comparing the evidence that was presented in Chad's case versus what was presented in Lori's case and look for inconsistencies between those things that might raise doubt about the credibility of whoever entered that evidence. It'll be things like that.
Right.
Uh, and then you're not even done then, because then it goes into a post-conviction phase. And, I've been involved in a number of these cases that will last 10, 15, 20 years. I had one death penalty case that I worked on in post-conviction for 18 years. So the stuff just kind of never ends. So you'll be a lot older by the time that you write the last story on this.
Well, yeah, especially with Chad, because it is a death penalty case in Idaho. So,
Right,
and
that's right.
Idaho moves relatively slow when it comes to death. In fact, every case is on hold right now while they figure things out. So,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll see if it happens. He could die on death row.
Most of them do.
Yeah,
And and Lori, kind of, even though it's not a death penalty case, I mean, it's these things do drag on for 20 years, and most people on death row die of natural causes.
yeah. Rich, thank you so much.